page 221 under the heading Dependency, and just deal with aspects in respect of which this report either supplements the previous report or differs from the previous report.
So this report contains some more data than we had in the 2002 report, and we're able to look at the prevalence of cannabis dependence in Table 3.
That's on page 221.
Page 221, 6.3. And you can see there that cannabis dependence was a significant issue, particularly in young males aged between 16 and 29.
And do the conclusions differ than those which you gave previously when going through the previous report?
No, we knew that cannabis was a dependence-producing drug. We now have more data on that, and that is one of the reasons we say it is not harmless.
Paragraph 7 on page 223, effects in individuals with established schizophrenia. Anything you need to add there? We also deal with the theme of schizophrenia in paragraph 8 on page 224.
I think it's important to keep emphasizing this relationship between cannabis and psychosis. So many people who have mental illness use cannabis. Many people with schizophrenia use cannabis. And this can make some of their symptoms worse. And those symptoms are the symptoms that doctors tend to focus on. So from the medical profession, cannabis seems to worsen some aspects of schizophrenia. It doesn't cause it, but it can worsen the symptoms. When you speak to patients, why do you use cannabis when it means it's, say for instance, the voices get louder? They will often say to you, well, I use it because it helps me think more clearly. It helps me to overcome some of the side effects of the medicine. I enjoy it. I've got no other pleasures in life. So the relationship is complex. Most of the people with psychosis who use cannabis aren't dependent on it. They're using it because they get something from it. The medical profession get concerned about the bad effects they get, and we tend not to focus on the reasons they use it. They're self-medicating for other problems. So it's not fair to say that just because psychosis is worse on cannabis, that cannabis is deleterious to people with psychosis. We can see from some of the more recent data that's reported in the American Medical Association and a book, that in fact it turns out that people with schizophrenia who use cannabis often are performing better and more cognitively intact than people who don't use cannabis. And that could be because cannabis is helping them think more clearly. So it is a very complicated question. And you cannot simply say that because people with psychosis or schizophrenia use cannabis, it's necessarily bad for them. So in 224, we go into this in quite a bit more detail. And rather than go through it all, I've said most of what I've said before, we can say that if cannabis contributes to schizophrenia, it contributes a very small fraction of the number of cases of schizophrenia. And we go into some of the statistical discussions here. I showed you the data in my slides. There's no temporal time-related change in the diagnosis of schizophrenia over time in relation to the consumption of cannabis. And if you go to 227, 8.10.1, this is the key figure here. So we say at the last sentence of that paragraph on page 227, if you look at the increased risk of cannabis that some people claim, if that were true, we can then compute that to prevent one case of schizophrenia in men aged between 20 to 24, you have to stop about 5,000 young men from ever smoking cannabis. And the figure for women is about 7,000. Now, we don't know how to stop people using cannabis. Even if we did, it would be a very inefficient use of public health resources to try to stop schizophrenia by stopping young men or young women smoking cannabis, because the gains are so slight. The number of people you have to intervene with of 5,000 to stop one case is just not something that a rational policy, a rational health policy, is certainly not a policy that you could in any way believe that criminalization of users or some kind of penal sanctions on users could ever be warranted to justify such a tiny gain in outcome.
And then under the heading anxiety and depression.
Yes, well, again, we looked very systematically at the data we had there, and the answer is there are associations, because people who use cannabis are often anxious, and some become anxious as a result of using it. But it's very difficult, if not impossible, to disentangle the self-medication. Anxious people use cannabis to calm them down. Depressed people use cannabis to help them deal with their depression. It's very unclear whether cannabis use contributes to these disorders in a meaningful way.
Page 228, the gateway theory.
Well, this really just repeats what we said in the previous report. The gateway theory is a theory. It has very, very little in the way of empirical evidence. Most people who use cannabis do not go on to using harder drugs. Most people who use harder drugs have used drugs other than cannabis. And therefore, we conclude in 815, if the gateway exists, it is small, and less than that associated with the use of alcohol and tobacco.
Page 229, under the heading societal harms. First subheading is effects on performance.
Here we have a slightly updated consideration, conclusion from the previous. We now make reference to more laboratory studies that have looked at the impact of cannabis on functioning when people are doing tests and tasks. And here we can report it has a dose-dependent effect on motor control. People are less precise in what they do. They're less good at solving complex problems when they're under the influence. They're slightly more impulsive at making decisions where to push the button, but they do not take more risks. So that's another distinction from alcohol.
Under the subheading criminal and antisocial behavior, there's talk of a study that was done. Tell us about that.
Yes, this is a study looking at the use of cannabis and the sharing of cannabis in young people. It was largely directed at finding out whether young people were dealing cannabis, and whether they were getting into criminal behaviors as a result of exposure to cannabis. And it showed that most of young people's interactions with cannabis and their friends are social. They're not marketing it to them.
If you could just deal with paragraph 9.5. It says a survey of 100 young people aged between 16 and 24 years who spent between £40 and £100 plus per week on cannabis indicated that the use of cannabis enabled them to relax, relieve boredom, and enhance otherwise mundane everyday activities. Nevertheless, young people also identified negative personal and social impacts, including lower academic attainment, poorer relationships with their parents, and the possibility of getting a criminal record. Less than half the respondents stated that they had engaged in any activity they would regard as antisocial after smoking cannabis, and few suggested there was a causal link.
So this was an attempt to understand why young people use cannabis, because the use has been booming, and we wanted to know whether they were using it because they were dependent or whether this was still out of choice. And this report indicates that young people use cannabis for the similar reasons that older people use cannabis, to help them relax, to relieve boredom, and enhance otherwise mundane everyday activities. But they're aware of the consequences. They're aware that if you are stoned all the time, then you won't do as well at school, and you may get into trouble with your parents. And they're also very well aware that they might get a criminal record. So they're not doing this in a thoughtless way, they're doing it knowing what the consequences are. And it's interesting that the majority of them had not engaged in any antisocial behavior after smoking cannabis, which fits with the general perception that cannabis doesn't lead to criminal activity or other antisocial activity.
And there's a heading, cultivation of cannabis, on page 230.
Yes, so what had happened in the period between our first cannabis review and the second one here was there was growing evidence of a switch from imported cannabis from Morocco to these homegrowns, the so-called factories, cannabis factories being set up in the UK. These are a direct consequence of the successful seizures at the ports of imported cannabis. And these internal factories were quite problematic because they were often being run by Vietnamese gangs who were putting young Vietnamese men into them, some as young as 13, as gardeners. So they would be put into the factory and told to look after it and make sure the plants grew well, with very little hope of getting out and very little income. They were effectively slaves to the production of cannabis. And this was a great concern to us. And these factories were not only producing a lot of strong skunk cannabis, but some of them were also stealing electricity and stealing water from domestic users. And the police were finding that they were becoming the major source of skunk in our country. And this is what happens when you turn off one market or one source to a market, the Moroccan imports, another source develops because the demand isn't going to go away. The demand is there, it's not driven by the availability.
In pages 231 to 233, there's some discourse about potency.
Yes.
Give us.
So this is the data that I referred to when I was talking about our concerns about how potency was increasing because people were switching from imported herbal or resin to homegrown skunk. And if you go to table 5 on page 232, you look at the concentration of the active ingredient. My lord, look, the table there, table 5, you see the three different forms: sinsemilla, this new stuff, the skunk; resin, traditional crushed, pressed extracts of the flower; and imported herbal cannabis. And you can see that whereas the herbal cannabis was typically running at a concentration around about 5% THC, and the resin, where we have data about the same, we see this very rapid increase in the concentration of THC in the sinsemilla or skunk. And this is the business of getting more bangs for your buck. If you're investing in homegrown production, you will grow cultivars which are very strong in THC, and you will use a heating and a lighting system that maximizes the production of THC. So we're creating a stronger product. It's very analogous to what happened many centuries ago when people realized they could distill alcohol and go from 5%, 10% alcohol or 15% wine and distill it up to 30 to 40% strength of brandy or whiskey. The other thing we noted in table 3 was the point I've made before, that if you make the plant put its efforts into making THC, the stoning element, it doesn't make cannabidiol, the protective element. And you can see here how levels of cannabidiol are very much lower. CBD here in table 6,
Page 232.
Page 232. If you look at the first column, sinsemilla, you see the THC was about 14%, and the CBD virtually non-existent. We have changed the nature of the product to a THC dominant product, whereas the resin, which is coming from overseas, the more traditional way of growing and preparing the cannabis plant, there's a balance between THC and cannabidiol. They're about the same. And that's the same ratio as in Sativex. That is felt by many people to be the optimal ratio for getting the beneficial effects of cannabis.
Now, in a world where cannabis was not, there was no absolute prohibition, and we're talking about a regulated system,
Yes.
how would these observations which you make here in regard to the potency be dealt with?
So we have examples of this now through the Netherlands and also through the American medical marijuana situation. And the general experience is that people prefer a balanced mixture. There are some individuals, particularly those who become heavy users of cannabis, that push themselves to use the stronger variants. And there are this small group of people who are trying to get out of their heads on the very strong skunk. But the majority of people find the balanced mixture is the one they prefer. They prefer for the effects and for the medical effects.
And so in a regulated system, how would potency be determined, incentivized, dissuaded, those sorts of things?
So there are several ways you could do this. The first and most important thing is to make sure people know what they're getting. At present, you have no idea whether you're getting skunk or ordinary cannabis because there's no way of knowing. In the Netherlands, they have a range of different products with different ratios, and you can ask and inquire, and they will guide you, the experts, the users who sell the products will advise you. In Uruguay, they've made a decision only to make available very low THC cannabis, 2%, on the grounds that that would still be beneficial, relaxing, therapeutic, but would minimize the risk of intoxication and adverse effects. So different approaches have been taken by different localities, and time will tell which of these seems to be the most effective. But what you can say, I think, is that a combination of a regulated market where there is proper delineation and definition of concentrations and ratios, plus adequate education, is the one that is most likely to minimize harms and maximize benefits.
Page 234, there's a section dealing with public attitudes to cannabis. Tell us about that.
Yes. So, during the production of this report, we undertook a Mori poll to estimate what the public wanted. The debate about cannabis in the UK had become extremely polarized in the media. Some newspapers campaigning ferociously to go back to a very punitive approach, and others saying, let's go to a more liberal approach. And we were interested to know what the general public thought, because one of the government's justifications for controlling drugs is to protect the public, and the concerns of the public were seen by the government as being significant. In fact, our Misuse of Drugs Act actually allows a drug to be controlled, even if it's not harmful, if there is significant public concern. It's a rather odd aspect of the drug law, but it says public concern could warrant the control of a drug. Now, it's not possible to ascertain public concern by reading the newspapers. So we did a poll. We did the poll, the same poll that the government itself uses to get public opinion on whether it's doing the right kind of policies or not. And we asked a representative group of the public what they thought should happen. Should cannabis, which was now at Class C, should it be regraded to Class B or even to Class A? Or should it be downgraded and made legal? Or should it stay the same? And what was remarkable was that the majority considered cannabis to either be to stay as Class C or make it illegal. Less people wanted it reclassified to Class B or A.
So you said make it illegal.
Make it legal.
Make it legal. Sorry.
You can see here in 11.3.3, 11% of the population thought cannabis should be equivalent to Class A, 13% equivalent to Class B. So that's 24% of this representative group of the population thought that cannabis should be made, the punishment should be enhanced, the class should be made higher. 41% said it should stay as it is, Class C, with a 2-year maximum penalty for possession. And 27%, that is more than those who thought it should be A or B, 27% essentially said it should be legal, there should be no penalty. Now, that was a very powerful finding, and I think it shows how out of tune with the public many of our newspapers and some of our politicians are.
Page 237, you deal again with the epidemiology of cannabis use, physical harms, short-term harms to mental health. If you could just take us through that only insofar as it differs from what you told us previously when we were dealing with the previous report.
No, so this is simply a condensation of all the points I've made earlier. I don't think there is anything new here. I suppose in 238, para 12.6, we are emphasizing that dependency should be taken seriously, as we take seriously dependency on drugs such as alcohol or heroin. It's a real problem. It's a problem that is not going away despite the criminal sanctions against users. So we should therefore try to develop health approaches to it. And then the others are, these are just condensations, discussion points around the points I've already made.
All right.
I think maybe one other thing, perhaps I didn't talk about this already, 12.14.
Page 239.
239. And maybe it's worth 12.13 and 12.14. 12.13 relates to acquisitive crime. We know in the UK that half of all acquisitive crime is associated with alcohol and quite a lot with heroin.
What is acquisitive crime?
Acquisitive crime is taking something that belongs to someone else. So burglary, armed robbery, pickpocketing, etc. Alcohol in particular is strongly associated with burglary, possibly because people get drunk to get the courage to do it. And heroin, of course, is associated with a lot of street crime. But there was no evidence to suggest that cannabis is related to that kind of crime. And also, the media concern that the use of cannabis, particularly skunk, was leading to antisocial behavior was not borne out by the evidence we took, and nor by the questionnaire we did with the public. People have become frightened of those who use cannabis because the media have fueled and bloated any reports of antisocial behavior on cannabis. Cannabis is not a drug that makes much of a contribution to antisocial behavior. And then we talk more about the public perception and opinions on 240. The police were very interesting here. The police used to be very in favour of reducing the severity of penalties for cannabis. They saw cannabis users, the need to prosecute cannabis users as a distraction, as an irritation. And then they were incentivized. Prosecuting cannabis users became a measure of success, and so they switched. And of course, part of the justification for criminalizing users was to try to persuade policemen who were doing this that they were doing a good thing. But a lot of policemen did not believe that. They still felt it was wrong to be criminalizing young people for using a drug which was less harmful than their favorite drug, which is alcohol. So I think overall, I've said it all here, the recommendation was to do quite a lot of research and education, but to keep the classification as it was, as Class C. And that is, I think, on well, maybe it's at the very end. Well, I think it's also in the letter at the beginning. I think they recommend it. Yes, so, yes, 13.5.1, 242, cannabis should remain a Class C drug. So that's the lowest class. That's alongside benzodiazepines and not alongside heroin or crystal meth.
What are benzodiazepines?
Those are drugs like Valium that are sedatives. They can be misused by people. Okay.
And these two reports, subject to what you said now, I take it you adopt them as part of your evidence?
I do.
Professor, if you could you please tell us what your view is in regard to whether or not there is credible scientific evidence to suggest that cannabis is effective in preventing either certain conditions or the symptoms associated with those conditions? Is there credible evidence to suggest that cannabis is effective?
Well, there's considerable amount of evidence that cannabis can be effective across a range of different symptoms, either to prevent or to ameliorate symptoms of distress.
Now, I obviously wouldn't expect you off the top of your head to remember a whole list of conditions to which that would apply, so I'd like to read out to you a series of conditions. And if you are of the view that there is credible scientific evidence to suggest that cannabis is effective in either preventing or treating that condition or the symptoms associated with that condition, I would ask you to just say yes. And if not, say no. I see there's an objection.
Lord, my learned friend and I both rose simultaneously, so he might have something different to say to me. He has indicated I must go first. That's not acceptable what our learned friend has proposed. This man who's leading in evidence is an expert. He either knows or he doesn't know. To be led on this issue, my Lord, is not acceptable, as your Lordship.
Thank you. Mr. Bokapa.
We expect such information to be contained in his own reports now.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Mahon.
My Lord, it's simply a practical issue to, I mean, there could be 100 conditions. You can't be expected to learn them off by heart. There's two ways we can deal with it. One, it is in his summary. I could turn him to the list and ask him to confirm it. Or we could ask the experts during an adjournment, perhaps overnight, to draw up a list and then present it perhaps in evidence.
The first option might that not be
certainly, my Lord. I have no difficulty with that, my Lord.
Ask the witness to...
Yes, I in fact wanted
to
to prevent the perception of leading the witness, which I thought that might create, but if that's...
But then you'll refer the witness to the part in his report.
Yes, certainly, my Lord.
Yes.
Could I refer you, Professor Nutt, to page 138?
Yes.
Paragraph 2.1.2 reads as follows. There is credible scientific evidence to suggest that cannabis is effective in preventing and or treating the conditions of and or symptoms associated with the following. And there are 17 conditions which are listed there on page 138. If you could cast your eye over them and then let us have your comment on whether that is correct or whether you wish to qualify it in any way.
So, well, we have already discussed the fact that there are licensed cannabis medications for chronic pain and for the side effects of cancer treatment. There's also a considerable amount of evidence that some cancers may respond to cannabinoids. There's good evidence in human trials that cannabinoids can help with the wasting of HIV and also the side effects of HIV treatment. There is credible evidence that cannabis can be useful in people with attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And in fact, a clinical trial on that has recently been conducted by colleagues of mine in London. There's credible evidence that individuals who switch from drinking to using cannabis will reduce the harms of alcohol, and my own studies have shown that alcoholics who use cannabis show less alcohol-related brain damage than those who don't. Alzheimer's disease, cannabis can be used to help reduce some of the behavioral disturbances of Alzheimer's disease, and there is a very exciting new development published just a few months ago showing that at least in animal models of Alzheimer's disease, cannabis can protect against or slow down the progression of the disease. In arthritis, there isn't evidence that cannabis can reduce arthritis itself, but there is evidence it can be used to help deal with the pain of arthritis and the sleep disruption that pain can produce. We've already mentioned that many people use it to help deal with anxiety. And again, many people use alcohol to deal with anxiety, and I would contend that cannabis would certainly be a safer option. The inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, is one of the reasons why very many people have taken to using cannabis. Trials have not been conducted for the reasons I said, that it's very difficult to do, but the public discourse on the value of Crohn's disease, particularly cannabis in terms of reducing the pain and the diarrhea, is very strong, and certainly I'm comfortable saying I believe it helps those symptoms. With epilepsy, one of the reasons many American states made cannabis legal was because the strong anecdotal evidence that certain forms of epilepsy, particularly the severe epilepsies in childhood, Dravet syndrome and also Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which had failed to respond to many different anti-epileptic drugs and many combinations of those drugs. So the point was children were having seizures up to 10 times an hour, and their lives were destroyed, and their families' lives were destroyed. We see now that the use of cannabis extracts, cannabis oil, can be transformational. And there's one very famous case which the young girl was having hundreds of seizures a week and is now going to school. So there is unquestionably the case that cannabis can help in forms of epilepsy. And a clinical trial with a variant of Sativex is going on with that. For mood disorders, people use cannabis to treat their depression. We don't have systematic studies, again, because there's very little interest in the pharmaceutical industry in developing that, but I think certainly the sleep disruption of depression may be ameliorated by cannabis. Heart disease and cardiovascular problems. This may seem paradoxical because I told you earlier on that cannabis can elevate blood pressure and potentially be problematic for people who have a history of heart disease, particularly angina. The interest here is more that components of the cannabis plant might be useful in people with heart failure, and it might increase the capacity of the heart to pump and therefore help people overcome heart failure. And heart failure is a growing problem. It's one of the very few disorders in medicine we have really almost no new interventions for, and we haven't had for many years. So there is there are at least academics developing an interest in that question. Hepatitis C, people with hepatitis C are very often drug users. They're often wasted, they're often in pain, and it's credible that cannabis may be used to help them deal with those symptoms. And again, because cannabis doesn't affect the liver, it's way preferred as a drug to be used than a drug like alcohol. Insomnia, there are now many people who report the benefits of cannabis, smoking cannabis for insomnia, also taking cannabis in the form of chocolates for insomnia, and there are studies showing that it does promote sleep. Multiple sclerosis, the original trials of Sativex were in multiple sclerosis. It's licensed for that indication. Osteoporosis, somewhat more speculative. Cannabis will help people with pain in their bones, but also it's now been demonstrated that cannabinoids are important in bone growth. So there is interest in whether we can use the products of the cannabis plant to promote bone growth, particularly in postmenopausal women. Post-traumatic stress disorder, this is an area that is of considerable research interest at present. Small trials have happened. They are positive in their outcome. Many, many people turn to cannabis to deal with the nightmares of their trauma. Many more turn to alcohol. Most who've tried both say that cannabis gives them more relief and is less damaging to their bigger long-term health. So I think I've covered them all.
You've now discussed numerous harms which you say can be associated with the use of cannabis, and benefits. What is your opinion in relation to the harms relative to the benefits?
Oh, I have very clearly of the opinion that the benefits of cannabis, when used medicinally, far outweigh the harms.
And what is your opinion regarding the harms associated with the use of cannabis?
So sorry? Yes.
Relative to the harms associated with its continued criminalization?
Cannabis is not a harmless drug. I have emphasized that all through my evidence today, all through my reports. Much of the harms of cannabis, however, come from the fact it is criminalized, it's sold in the black market with poor quality control. Those harms that have been claimed for cannabis, such as schizophrenia, 2.1.4, decrease in IQ and motivation, respiratory disease, cancer and dependency, they have been grossly exaggerated by so-called experts who have a belief that this drug should be kept illegal and have tried to trawl up any kind of evidence to support this a priori belief that this drug should be made illegal. I have given you examples of the exaggeration of these claims, and more than that, even if these claims were true, they do not warrant prohibition in the way it's carried out today for the reasons I've spelt out, because many of those harms were exaggerated. And also, they don't warrant a particular fixation on cannabis. The people who argue that cannabis should stay illegal because it is harmful, almost to a person, forget or ignore, they must be aware of it, they ignore the fact that alcohol is a more harmful drug on almost every one of the arguments that they use against cannabis. And they do that, well, my presumption is they do that because they know that if we were to compare alcohol and cannabis, alcohol would come out badly. And I think, to be honest, it's a dereliction of scientific duty. Scientists who claim a drug should be banned because it's harmful should not blinker themselves to one drug. They have a responsibility to humanity to focus on all the drugs that humans use. And the focus on trying to find harms of cannabis while deliberately ignoring the harms of alcohol, I think, is unscientific, and it demeans the integrity of experts who do that.
The comparative analysis that you've undertaken, scaling the potential harms of different drugs, to your knowledge, would such a similar or corresponding exercise, was it possible to have undertaken such an exercise at the time that cannabis was first criminalized?
It's always possible to apply scientific processes to any decision making. It would have been perfectly possible in 1934 to have done that, perfectly possible. Obviously there was less evidence then, but maybe, Your Lordship, I could just tell you a little bit about the history of cannabis. We haven't talked, and you may hear later about this, but since about 1880, people have tried to find reasons.
Please.
Lord, we've already listened to part of this. This is not an historian that's sitting before your Lordship, and it's contained nowhere in even his annexures.
Yes,
And we object to this evidence, my Lord.
thank you.
Well, my Lord, it may be anecdotal, but if there's something that he knows, the the veracity of what he knows can be dealt with in argument, of course, but if there's something that he knows, then it might be of use to your lordship.
But do you think that what the witness is about to say is relevant to this discussion?
Well, my lord, just by way of example, by virtue of his position as a scientist, he will also know the history behind the science. And so he is better placed than someone who's not a scientist to talk about that history. I say that merely to illustrate that although he's not a historian, we sometimes come into contact with facts which we accept as truths, given that they have been historically accepted as truths in the field in which we work. And that's really, I think, merely what the witness is alluding to, my lord.
Yes. Would you try to be as brief as
Yes,
possible?
very briefly, my
without
lord.
Giving,
Yeah. I will be very brief. I would just want to say that the arguments we are rehearsing here about the harms of cannabis, particularly around psychosis, started being rehearsed in the 1880s with the British Hemp Commission, explored the question in India, and they came to the conclusion then, the same conclusion as I have come to, that the use of cannabis is not a cause of schizophrenia. So we have 100 years of repeating these arguments, and people really, I think, should be aware that this is a process of trying to justify keeping the drug illegal rather than a true scientific understanding of the drug.
yes, thank you.
Your summary starts at page 133, and there are certain aspects which you indicated that you wanted to clarify or correct. Could I ask you to turn to paragraph 10 on page 134? It reads, in November 2010, the expert published another study in The Lancet, co-authored with Les King and Lawrence Phillips, on behalf of his own independent committee, item number 10 in the plaintiff's discovery affidavit dated 6 April 2016. This study ranked the harm done to users and society by a range of drugs, owing in part to criticism over the arbitrary weighting of the factors in the 2007 study. The new study employed a multi-criteria decision analysis procedure and concluded that alcohol is more harmful to society than both heroin and crack, while heroin, crack, and methamphetamine, crystal meth, locally known as TIC, were the most harmful drugs to individuals, and then it has the words in brackets, excluding alcohol, close brackets. What do you have to say about that?
No, that's a typo. The excluding alcohol should be deleted.
The both the words.
Just the two words in the brackets, that's all. That was a mistake.
Paragraph 1.1.2 on page 136. This thing, journals. There's reference to a journal article titled Effects of Schedule 1 Drug Laws on Neuroscience Research and Treatment Innovation, authored by inter alia the expert, as appears in The Lancet, item number 15, the plaintiff's discovery affidavit.
Yes, that should read Nature Reviews Neuroscience, which you have.
That's the article that we looked at previously.
Correct, that's right.
So instead of the words The Lancet, it should read Nature Reviews Neuroscience.
Correct.
Page 137, paragraph 1.1.5.3. This is also a reference to the article which we looked at, but it's dated online publication in 2002. Is that correct?
So this we have this is this is not 2002. This is the 2008. That should say 2008.
Page 139. Paragraph 2.1.5.3. Say, in any event, so you're referring here to the majority of the alleged ill effects associated with cannabis use. in any event fall well within the parameters of the scientifically established harms of non-prohibited substances such as tobacco, alcohol, and opioids. What do you say there?
Well, it may be confusing to people to have opioids there because some opioids are more harmful. Maybe some, like codeine, are of the same order. So that may be too general a term. So perhaps we should delete opioids.
Okay. Now you've read through the contents of your expert summary, have you not?
I have.
And subject to the changes which you've now indicated, you confirm its correctness?
I do.
I'd like then to deal with some of the defendants' expert summaries. The defendants' expert summaries appear in file 5. Have you read the defendants' expert summaries?
I have.
There may be one which you may not have seen that came in, when was the last one? Last week? Thursday. If memory serves, it was on Thursday of last week where a new expert summary was delivered by the 1st to 7th defendants in relation to a criminologist. I'm sure you would not have seen that.
Not seen that.
Sorry, you shook your head. Did you say no?
I have not seen that, no.
Have you read through the summary of Mr. Bayeva at
Yes.
Page 5?
I have.
Now, I'm not going to go through the summaries line by line. No doubt the propositions will be put to you under cross-examination by my learned friends. But just by way of a few general things, you will have seen that Mr. Bayeva, I beg your pardon, might be Dr. Bayeva, no, Mr. Bayeva, I think. He relies on evidence that cannabis is destructive to the brain. What is your view on that?
Well, he doesn't cite any evidence, and that's presumably because there isn't any. Although it depends on what he means. In terms of changing brain structure, then I don't think there's really any evidence at all. I mean, Lord, I maybe just explain something here. The way in which the brains of people who use cannabis are studied is usually to take a group of cannabis users and image their brains, and then take a group of non-cannabis users and image their brains. And when you do brain imaging, and I do a lot of it, you get many results. You can divvy the brain up into thousands of different sections. And then what happens is that people look to see, is there a difference in one of these many subparts of the brain between the cannabis users and the non-cannabis users? And if you do enough comparisons, you will find significant differences. Normally in science, we have a criterion of 1 in 20. If something happens more with a likelihood of less than 1 in 20, then it's unlikely to be random. When you're doing many comparisons, there's a good chance that by random you will find more than 1 in 20 that are actually occur, but they are still random. because there's such a desire in the scientific community, particularly the American-funded NIDA, to find problems with cannabis users, to justify cannabis staying illegal, these findings get reported, even if they're statistically invalid, and even if they don't have any meaningful biological outputs. I would say to you, you can find as many papers showing that cannabis increases brain size as decreases brain size. But all the emphasis is on the negative rather than the positive. And this is why I find it remarkable that Mr. Beyever can say that it's destructive to the brain, because even those people who do claim it has an impact on the brain, no one has ever shown it damages brain tissue, unlike alcohol, which clearly does. So I find that statement just way beyond the evidence at present.
Mr. Beyever also refers to the fact that cannabis appears to have become more potent over the years. And
Yes.
the suggestion, if I may paraphrase, is that legalizing or decriminalizing cannabis will result in people taking more potent doses of cannabis, which will have detrimental effects.
Well, I've already dealt with this in relation to the UK situation. We have seen that it's the criminalization of cannabis users and the criminalization of production and supply that has led to the growth of the stronger variants. So where we have more rational regulatory approaches, like the Netherlands, like Spain with their cannabis clubs, like Portugal, where decriminalization of possession of all drugs exists, we don't see significant changes. We don't see people craving the strong cannabis any more than we see people preferring to drink whiskey to wine in this country. People make rational choices if they have a choice. In the black market, they don't have a choice, but in a regulated market, they would have a choice. And I don't believe that people would want harder, stronger versions, because they're less pleasant. People find them less easy to take.
Mr. Beyever also makes the observation that cannabis contains 50% more tar than a comparable sample of ordinary tobacco and 70% more of the hydrocarbon benzoaperone.
And we touched on this again in my evidence. Yes, a single cannabis cigarette will produce more tar and more potential carcinogens than a single tobacco cigarette. But people tend to smoke many, many more tobacco cigarettes than cannabis cigarettes because they have more addictive properties. The effects of nicotine are shorter lasting than the effects of cannabis. So in a lifetime, tobacco is much more destructive. And we can't find any evidence around the world, particularly in countries like Jamaica, where cannabis use amongst Rastafarians has been very high for decades now. We don't see any evidence that these carcinogenic substances are leading to cancers, lung cancers. You know, there are some cases of lung disease in heavy smokers of cannabis, but the proportion of individuals who get lung disease is much less than the proportion of smokers, because cannabis burns at a lower temperature and you use much less of the plant material during the course of your exposure to it than you do with tobacco.
At page 17 is the report on cannabis and its use in South Africa by Shabir Banu. Please, if the witnesses may be watching or listening, I don't mean any disrespect if I mispronounce the names. And there's an observation made by Shabir Banu in regard to the mixture of cannabis with other potentially toxic substances when when smoked.
Yes.
What do you say about that?
I say that that is a problem wherever there's a black market. It's not a problem in the Netherlands. No one's mixing heroin or fentanyl with cannabis in the Netherlands. But in my country, they're commonly putting a little bit of crack in with the cannabis to help people get a bit more of a buzz so they can get to like crack and get addicted to crack, or a little bit of heroin. In your country, I gather there are multiple different substances that are put into cannabis cigarettes to change the taste and change the addictiveness potentially. That would not happen in a regulated market. That would, one of the great advantages of regulation is that you can regulate. You can make sure that what is sold is what should be sold.
And then there's at page 57, the opinion of Dr. Lokhandra Naidu. You've read that report?
I have.
What is your comment on that?
Well, this report, like the others, essentially, it just rehearses the current incorrect opinions that many toxicologists, doctors, pharmacologists have about cannabis. It focuses on cannabis without taking into account comparative harms of other drugs. And it has a sort of assumption that because the drug's illegal, there must be some rationale for that, and seeks to bolster that decision by finding harms from cannabis.
Yes, then if I could turn you to page 79. In fact, before we get to 79, the start of this summary is at page 75.
Mm-hmm.
This is the summary of Franco Pierre Visser. You've read the summary?
I have.
And at page 79, there's a quote. The third paragraph on page 79 is in quotation marks and in italics, with a reference given at the end, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime 2016, own emphasis added. The quote reads as follows: "The nature and extent of the potential health risks and harms associated with cannabis use are continually under debate. Cannabis use can be perceived to be relatively harmless when compared with the use of other controlled psychoactive substances, and also in relation to the use of tobacco or alcohol. However, lower risk does not mean no risk. There are harmful health effects associated with a higher frequency of cannabis use and initiation at a very young age, especially among adolescents during the time of their cognitive and emotional development. Adverse health effects of cannabis use associated with cognitive impairments or psychiatric symptoms are well documented in the scientific literature." You read that quote?
I have.
Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I think the key point of that paragraph is that it really says what I've been saying all along. That it's not harmless, but it's relatively harmless when compared with alcohol, tobacco, and many other of the controlled substances, such as heroin, crack cocaine, crystal meth, etc. I have never said there is no risk. I've always said that the risk of cannabis does not warrant prohibition with the level of intensity that has been exercised throughout the world, largely in the last 70 years. And in fact, it's the prohibition which has significantly contributed to the development of harms.
Right, so then, in the same file which you have, there should be a divider which reads 8th Defendant's Expert Bundle. And if you go into that divider, at page 6, you will find the 8th Defendant's Notice in terms of Rule 36(9)(b), expert summary for Professor, it says Betha, I think that's a typo, I believe it's Bertha, K. Madras, or Madras, not sure how to pronounce it. Have you read the summary of Professor Madras?
I have.
Tell us broadly what your views are in regard to what she says.
Dr. Madras is a very well-established, high-quality biochemical psychologist, high-quality scientist, without any doubt at all. Has worked for over 40 years in the area of the brain science, the brain biochemistry of drug addiction. Her particular target has been to try to develop new treatments for addiction through changing the way dopamine, the neurotransmitter dopamine, is released and regulated in the brain. So she is unquestionably a scientist of high standing and high quality. The problem I have with her report is that she is not a researcher of cannabis. She has, in her list of over 200 publications, there are only 2 publications that relate to cannabis, and they both relate to synthetic cannabinoids, and the studies are done in monkeys. And when I go through her CV and her report, it's clear to me that Dr. Madras is essentially taking a position here as an anti-cannabis campaigner. She is not being scientifically neutral in the approach she takes. She gives many, many lectures in the USA to school children and to other groups that are concerned about drug abuse, and I have no doubt that she shares with them her concerns about the abuse and the misuse of many drugs, including cannabis. But in her report, she shows a complete and total disregard for the comparative harms of cannabis in relation to other drugs. In that sense, I believe her report is biased, and I think she has set out to provide as convincing a criticism of cannabis as she could. I don't see this as a balanced report. I see this really as a polemic against the use of cannabis, and in particular the use of cannabis as a medicine. And the reason I say the latter statement is that all the way through this report, the assumption is made that the American FDA has the rights to decide on what's a medicine, and that the American Drug Enforcement Agency guidelines are the appropriate guidelines to decide on whether a drug should be legal or illegal. Whether we wish to believe those or not is a matter of discussion, but to pursue those without any understanding of the South African situation and without any scientific comparison of harms of drugs such as alcohol and tobacco, I think is not scientific. And therefore I find her evidence singularly lacking in balance and vision.
Paragraph 4 says, Professor Madras's research focuses on contrasting molecular and behavioral effects of THC and psychostimulant drugs on adolescent and adult brains. A brain imaging drug she invented with collaborators was evaluated through the FDA process. She is familiar with the literature showing marijuana's effects, the potential or lack of isolated cannabinoids as medicine, and the adverse effects of marijuana use. Care to comment?
Yes, so she has developed with her collaborators a drug, which is a dopamine reuptake targeting drug, and she was able to evaluate that both as or similar drugs, as tools for brain imaging of the dopamine system and as a possible diagnostic marker for Parkinson's disease, and also as a potential treatment for addiction to stimulant drugs such as cocaine. The theory there being that cocaine works on the same site as the drug she invented, and therefore if you were to block that site with her drug, then there's a chance that cocaine would not bind and therefore would not have its effect. So it would be like an antagonist to cocaine. And that's a very interesting approach. I applaud the approach. It makes sense in terms of what we know about cocaine. It does not really make sense in terms of what we know about cannabis. Cannabis has little, if any, impact on the dopamine system in the brain. But more than that, and this I think gets to the issue I raised earlier today, in all her long career as a researcher, she hasn't taken a drug through the FDA process to market. And one of the reasons she's not being able to do that is because the criteria, the regulatory requirements that she's had to work through are the ones that I've explained are so detrimental to research. And this has held back her research enormously. So yes, she's managed to start the process, but she has unfortunately been thwarted by the bureaucracy. I have no doubt she is familiar with the literature on marijuana's effect, although she isn't, as I said, someone who particularly has researched marijuana, the comparative harms of marijuana, or even the effects of marijuana in the human brain. And I think she has tended to extrapolate from research on other drugs, such as stimulants, to extrapolate those results to those of marijuana in some cases.
She deals with the theory that dopamine is the core mediator of stimulant addiction and on developmental syndromes relating to dopamine, especially ADHD. Do you have any comment on that?
Oh, she's right in that regard. She's right in the regard there's very good evidence that dopamine is one of the key neurotransmitters involved in the disorder of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. She's correct in that respect, and her inventions could well be of utility in those disorders, just as they potentially could be in the treatment of stimulant dependence. I think they're less likely to be of value in the treatment of cannabis dependence or other symptoms of cannabis use.
Can you comment on Professor Madras's relationship with the National Institute of Drug Abuse, NIDA, in the USA?
So the National Institute of Drug Abuse in the USA is one of the government sections of the government's National Institutes of Health. It is by far and away the largest provider of research funds for studies of addiction in the world. So, for example, the American population is perhaps 6 times that of the British population. And the percentage of drug abuse in each country is pretty similar. But through NIDA, the Americans spend 1,000 times more research on addiction than we spend in the UK. And it'll be much more than what you spend in South Africa. So NIDA is the big funder. And it's a remarkable organization. It takes a very scientific approach to the question. But unfortunately, like all the institutes in National Institute of Health in America, it eventually serves the Senate rather than science. And it's proved very difficult for NIDA researchers to do anything other than pursue the NIDA line, that drugs are bad, and that therefore research that looks to find the benefits of drugs is frowned upon, and in fact not funded. So almost all NIDA research is predicated on that premise, that illegal drugs are harmful. It only studies illegal drugs. Illegal drugs are harmful. We have to find evidence to justify keeping them harmful. And until very recently, I'm not even sure it's changed today, until very recently, it was not possible for people working with NIDA to question the legal status of the drugs, to question whether these drugs should be legal at all, to question the scheduling of the drugs, and even to engage in research which might help people reduce the harms of these drugs. So their whole philosophy has been one of finding harms for drugs, finding the damage that drugs do in people, and then hopefully building on that new treatments, although very few treatments have been forthcoming.
If I could turn you to page 13, paragraph 15. Where Professor Madras, speaking in the third person, says, the science strongly supports the conclusion that marijuana has a high potential for abuse, has no currently accepted medical use, and that sufficient assurances of safety for use of marijuana under medical supervision are lacking. Any comment on that?
So, the problem here is we don't have definitions. What does a high potential for abuse mean? Does it mean that people use it even though it's illegal? Does it mean that everyone who uses it gets addicted? Does it mean it's got higher potential than tobacco or alcohol? No one knows what it means. The people who wrote this set of criteria, the Drug Enforcement Agency, don't know what that means. So we don't know what high means. I have shown you, no one's disagreed, I think, that marijuana does have a potential to cause dependence, but it's less of that than alcohol or tobacco. So does that mean high or not? And to what extent the abuse potential is determined by its illegality is unspecified. I would argue that most of the abuse that is referred to in that first phrase is due to its being illegal. The second phrase, it has no currently accepted medical use, well, that is patently wrong. Maybe Dr. Madras was not aware of the German situation. I imagine this report was written before Germany made it available as a medicine for 80 separate indications. But what she means is that it has no FDA currently accepted medical use. That is a gross perversion of what medical use means. She was well aware that she should have been well aware that it has been a medicine in the Netherlands for 17 years. That it was a medicine for many years before it was taken off the pharmacopoeia in the USA. She must certainly have been aware of the many trials that have been conducted in the last 20 years showing it has medical value. So I think that phrase hinges on accepted. And what she means, I believe, is that it hasn't got a licensed medical indication in America. The FDA has not approved it. That doesn't mean it doesn't have accepted medical use. Accepted medical use means doctors use it. A body of medical opinion believes that cannabis is a valuable medicine. That is accepted medical use. And then the final point, that sufficient assurances of safety for use of marijuana under medical supervision are lacking. Well, a drug that's been used for 4,000 years or more without any evidence of problematic medical use seems pretty safe to me. And I don't see any concerns that have arisen in the last 30 years where people have started to reuse marijuana as a medicine to say to me that the assurances of safety are not adequate. Further on in her report, she raises the spectre that it's impossible to grow plants with sufficient quality control so that individuals know when they take a dose, they're getting the same dose as they were getting the day before or the day after. That is wrong. We know Bedrocan in the Netherlands supplies medical marijuana of different concentrations on a reliable basis. It meets the criteria for the Dutch medical regulators. So the reality is that this statement is really a parroted statement from the Drug Enforcement Agency and the FDA and doesn't reflect the current status of the science of marijuana at present.
How would alcohol apply to these criteria listed here in paragraph 15?
I would say alcohol has a moderate potential for abuse when it's used in a recreational fashion. It does have no currently accepted medical use, that is true, and therefore the third part of that sentence is irrelevant because you wouldn't be using alcohol under medical supervision.
Just for the purposes of clarity, where Professor Madras refers to marijuana, are we to understand that that is the same thing as cannabis, or is there some distinction?
I presume that she is referring to cannabis. She doesn't specify what she's referring to, but I think we can assume that she's talking about medical cannabis the way we would be, or medical marijuana the way we would talk about medicinal cannabis. Yes.
Is there a distinction between marijuana and cannabis?
There's not a scientific distinction. Marijuana was a term that was brought in the 1930s when the first prohibition of cannabis was developed in the USA. It was brought in, I think, because it was a Mexican term, and the initial hysteria around which cannabis became made illegal was centered on the use of cannabis by Mexicans. So it was considered by the authorities that using the term marijuana would associate it more with Mexicans coming into America using marijuana. The alliteration was nice and powerful. And a hysteria was developed about reefer madness, about these marijuana using Mexicans, assaulting American women, corrupting American youth by giving them marijuana cigarettes. So it was a politically derived term, but I think in scientific terms, marijuana and medical cannabis, or cannabis, can be used interchangeably.
Page 14, paragraph 20.
The legalization of marijuana does not result in reduced
Whether
substance.
the cell phone is switched off or put on silent.
Thank you. Page 14, paragraph 20. The legalization of marijuana does not result in reduced substance abuse and the improvement of societal interests. What is your comment?
Well, that's not a scientific statement. What we can see is that where marijuana has moved out of the black market into a regulated market, such as in the Netherlands, marijuana consumption is less than it is in a country like the United Kingdom, a very similar genetic and social background, where it's illegal. The hot Dutch experiment shows us clearly that separating the marijuana market from the heroin market reduces access and use of heroin. And also in terms of, which is an enormous societal interest. And also there are other societal benefits of the Dutch model, not least of which they tax the sales and taxation goes into the public purse. So that statement 20, is just incorrect and indefensible, I would say.
Paragraph 21 reads, it is important to understand that the United States, and no doubt South Africa too, has long adhered to a scientifically driven process for reviewing and approving medicines to ensure that they are both safe and effective before they are released to the public. It is this process which includes large teams of chemists, pharmacologists.
Excuse me, ma'am. Will you please leave the courtroom? Make sure that you switch off your telephone and then come back. You are disturbing the court proceedings. Are you listening, ma'am? Please leave the courtroom. Make sure that your phone is on silent or switch it off and then you may come back.
Reads, it is this process which includes large teams of chemists, pharmacologists, physicians, microbiologists, veterinarians, and even lawyers, and not individual physicians or anecdotal information from users that determines whether a product has accepted medical uses and may be safely used as a medicine by the general public. Your comment?
Well, I think the first thing to say is Dr. Madras is not a doctor. She's not a medical doctor, she's not a physician. So what she is saying there is that the process of controlling and regulating medicines has clearly, unequivocally changed in the last 100 years. We now have complex licensing arrangements through organizations like the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration. The process of registering drugs now does require enormous teams of chemists, pharmacologists, physicians, etc. That's true for new drugs, but that should not be true for old drugs. And to impose that current approach to an established medicine is perverse. And I would also say another thing. People often confuse the licensing of a drug by the FDA, or your equivalent here, as permission for a doctor to use the drug. That is wrong. This process of whereby drugs go through a system of evaluation, which is often very complicated, can cost, as I said before, up to $1 billion, is not about allowing doctors to use the drug. It's about allowing the people that manufacture and sell the drug to do that. It's giving them a marketing authorization for the drug. And if people are selling drugs, then it's obviously critical that what they are selling has been validated and that they are not misleading the public. But a doctor can prescribe any medicine, particularly medicines that have existed previously, if there is a body of medical opinion that suggests it is of value. And I think it's inappropriate to apply this extraordinary process to something as complicated as cannabis, and in a country that doesn't have the large teams of chemists, pharmacologists, etc., such as South Africa. If we were to apply this process to South Africa, not a single non-Western medicine could be used. And that would be iniquitous and divisive and inappropriate.
She emphasizes this aspect at paragraph 24 on page 16. Where she says, it is as irrational to smoke marijuana for medicinal purposes in the 21st century as it was to chew bark to relieve a headache or smoke opium for pain in the 20th century. What is your comment?
Well, I would say that's a very irrational statement. If people want to chew bark to remove a headache, why shouldn't they? Many people still smoke opium for pain, even in this century. The question is not whether it's irrational, but whether it's rational to insist that there is only one model for development and validation of the use of drugs. And that model, this high-tech American model, is not only extraordinarily expensive, leading to enormously expensive drugs. It's a model which, as I said this morning, could never work for the cannabis plant. It would take centuries to do all the required studies in all the different disorders to determine whether the cannabis plant or the subcomponents of the cannabis plant that she believes in are effective. Because we have to take into account the entourage effect, where the different components may work together to benefit each other. No one is going to invest in that process. One thing's for sure, the NIDA aren't, the FDA aren't. By insisting on that kind of approach, they are effectively saying there will never be cannabis medications. And this is why they're saying it, because they are in the process of trying to stop what's going on with the states, the independent states in America making medicine out of marijuana. This is a process of trying to bolster the federal position that cannabis is a dangerous illegal drug. And even if one did have the enormous amounts of money to do this, it will be foolhardy, because the cost of doing it would mean that the drugs were so expensive, people would just go back and smoke the plant. So even if you could do it, it would not be useful, certainly not South Africa.
Are you able to give us any examples of substances which are generally accepted as having therapeutic effects despite not having gone through the process endorsed by Professor Madras?
Yes, so in the United Kingdom a few years ago, there was a suggestion made that scientists should not be allowed to research on any drug that did not have a medical license. I thought that was an absurd proposal. I went through the pharmacopoeia of a major hospital in my country, and I found that half of all the substances they were providing to their doctors were not medicines that had been regulated in this FDA fashion. There were medicines of historic use and background, medicines that were being used on a named patient basis, etc. One of the reasons for that is that pharmaceutical companies aren't interested in developing drugs for rare indications. They only want blockbusters. The reason for that, of course, is that it costs so much to develop a drug. If it costs $1 billion to develop a drug, you want to sell $2 or $3 billion worth of the drug in order to recoup your investment. Who's going to invest in disorders which only affect tens of thousands of people? So the majority of disorders which we treat as doctors are disorders that do not have drugs with a licensed indication, and will never have that because companies won't invest. So the answer is a lot of medicine is conducted by doctors who prescribe drugs which don't have a specific license for that indication and will never have that license. And that is the skill of medicine. Doctors' jobs, a good doctor understands what a drug does in one particular indication and then tries to extrapolate to others where there isn't any good evidence.
Could you give us a handful of examples of these sorts of substances?
Well, there are substances such as hormones, there are substances such as some peptides, there are substances such as different formulations of drugs which might be used, for instance, children. There's almost none of the registered treatments for adults have been tried in children. So almost all the prescriptions that doctors write for children are off license, outside the FDA license. They have to, because the companies do not find it economic to do the studies in children. The companies don't care. They don't want to sell to children because they're not a big market. So they're very happy for doctors to prescribe off license. And doctors have to do that and have to be allowed to do that.
In paragraph 25, it says, in 1938, the US safe drug supply system advanced once again as the newly formed FDA required strong scientific evidence of both effectiveness and safety for drug approval. The creation of the FDA, was in response to numerous examples of illness and death resulting from entrepreneurs who marketed dangerous drugs, tinctures, or other concoctions with unsubstantiated claims for medical benefit or safety. The FDA currently has a well-developed and rigorous evaluation and approval process for determining whether scientific evidence is adequate to support claims that a specific drug is effective and safe for use in diagnosing, mitigating, treating, or curing disease. When such claims are made about a substance, it is considered a drug under section 201G1 capital B of the Act, I assume she's referring to their domestic legislation, and is subject to regulation as such. Your comment on that?
Well, I'm not against regulation. In fact, I'm quite in favor of it. But that's just the key point. The creation of the FDA, as she says, was in response to numerous examples resulting from entrepreneurs who marketed dangerous drugs. Entrepreneurs who marketed. The FDA, as I explained, the process is making sure that people who market drugs market a drug that is safe and effective for a specific indication. That is not the sum total of medicine. Doctors, for centuries, working with pharmacists and pharmacopoeias, have prescribed drugs successfully and effectively to their patients, drugs which have never been through this process and will never go through this process. And also all traditional medicines have been used in the same way. And the reason we have confidence in their efficacy is because doctors and patients have gathered information over the centuries. It's impossible. It will never be the case that every drug a doctor prescribes could have gone through the FDA process. It would be ridiculously expensive, and it won't happen. So doctors have always had to do what's best for their patients, using their knowledge of traditional medicines, of old medicines, and of new medicines. And the fact that marijuana, cannabis, was a medicine for 150 years in Britain gives me pretty good confidence that at least it's safe, and there's a pretty reasonable chance it's effective. And we've seen now that many countries have given it a license in many different disorders, consistent with what was previously known about its efficacy.
Page 21, paragraph 33, reads, the FDA process has protected the American public from ineffective or I assume that should be even, dangerous drugs for more than 75 years. Drugs that do not meet this standard do not have accepted medical uses, in my opinion.
Well, she misunderstands the origins and the nature of the FDA process. The FDA process is about allowing people to market safe medicines. It's not about constraining what doctors do. And yes, the FDA process, it has many merits. I would not criticize it as a process for controlling what pharmaceutical companies say their drugs can do. That's a perfectly reasonable approach. But it completely eliminates or is irrelevant for traditional medicines and for old medicines. And also, I'll just share an anecdote with you. The FDA process is so complex and difficult and so obsessed with a fear of negative events that when in Britain we discovered beta blockers to lower blood pressure, they turned out to be extremely effective treatments, and they were rapidly adopted by our NHS and health services around the world. The FDA process of evaluating their safety took so long, it's estimated that tens of thousands of Americans died because they died before the medicine that could have saved them was licensed. So it's always a balance. The balance between protecting the public from the side effects of medicines has to be always countered with the harms that the public will accrue because an effective medicine is denied them, either temporarily or permanently. And I have to say, for cannabis, I cannot see there are any credible harms of using the drug as a medicine. But not allowing it to be used, I can see having enormous negative impacts on the millions of people who have disorders it might benefit. I mean, it's not as if we don't know the effects of using cannabis. You know, we have established through all these reports that millions, tens of millions of people worldwide use it and come to little harm. So why would we want to deny it to patients pending a process like the FDA regulation, which could never happen and will never happen, and if it were to happen, it would take centuries.
Do you have any comment on Professor Madras's ability or qualification to express an opinion on whether or not a substance which does not meet the standard has an accepted medical use?
I think she's stepping outside her area of professional expertise. She is not a prescribing doctor. She is parroting the FDA process, and I don't believe that's relevant to the practice of medicine, certainly not in South Africa.
In paragraph 34, it reads, the marijuana plant, like other plants, is not reasonably amenable to analysis by the current established FDA approval process. While many of our medicines have their origin in plant-derived compounds, Professor Madras is unaware of any whole plant that has been approved for medical use in recent times. What is your comment on that?
Well, she should talk to the Germans and many Europeans, because not only have they approved cannabis, but they have also approved hypericum, St. John's wort, well-established treatment for anxiety and depression in Germany. That is a whole plant which is taken as a medicine.
Tell us a bit more about hypericum, St. John's wort.
So hypericum is a herb which produces bioactive substances that are useful in lifting mood and reducing anxiety. We don't entirely know what they are. There are reasons why it's not easy to extract them and turn them into traditional modern medicines, but there's very good evidence, well, certainly good enough for the German state to reimburse doctors who prescribe hypericum for disorders such as anxiety and depression.
And then paragraph 39, which is quite lengthy, says the Attorney General or his delegate may, after recommendation from HHS, decide to add a substance to a schedule or to transfer a scheduled substance to another schedule if it is found that such drug or other substance has a potential for abuse. A substance may also be removed from the schedule if it is determined that the substance does not meet the requirements for inclusion in any schedule. The recommendation to schedule a substance, as opposed to the decision of where to schedule a substance, is made on the basis of the following criteria, and she sets out 8 criteria. 1, its actual relative potential for abuse. 2, scientific evidence of its pharmacological effects. 3, the state of current scientific knowledge regarding the drug or other substance. 4, its history and current pattern of abuse. 5, the scope, duration, and significance of abuse. 6, what, if any, risk there is to the public health. 7, its psychic or physiological dependence, liability. And 8, whether the substance is an immediate precursor of a substance already controlled. Any comment on that?
Well, these are reasonable criteria that one might consider when deciding whether to schedule a drug as an illegal drug. These are reasonable criteria. The challenge with them is what are the measures of abuse, what are the measures of patterns of abuse, what are the measures of its dependence, etc. So the proof of the pudding here really lies in how you apply these rules. And also, of course, why you would not apply them to a drug like alcohol, but you would apply them to a drug like cannabis.
And part of that same paragraph at the bottom, she gives seemingly a legislative reference. And then she says, in addition, the United States has obligations to control marijuana's use under international treaties, conventions, and protocols.
Well, that is true. And I think all the countries, including South Africa, that have signed up to the international treaties do have an obligation under those treaties to control the drugs that are controlled under those treaties, even if those drugs are inappropriately controlled. A country has several ways, therefore, to deal with this. The way that the Dutch dealt with it was to say, we're going to control the drug, but we're going to license it rather than ban it, because the UN conventions do not specify that the control has to be at the level of a criminal sanction. It's perfectly acceptable to control it at the level of a civil sanction. Countries like Spain, with their cannabis coffee shops, have essentially taken the same view, that you register, you go to a cannabis club, you share your cannabis with other people. There's no profit involved, there's no transaction, and you don't get in the way of the general public when you use cannabis. Other countries have taken a different view. Uruguay has just decided that the conventions are, I think, wrong, and therefore decided to make cannabis legal in Uruguay, although it is a controlled state-regulated market. So it's perfectly possible for countries to change the regulations to allow recreational use out with the conventions. And certainly every country has a right to decide what's a medicine in its own country, and therefore the medical use of this drug isn't subject to those international treaties.
Lord, I see it's 2 minutes to 4. Perhaps it's a convenient time to take the adjournment. But before we do, my Lord, I don't mean for your Lordship to give us any indication necessarily now, but you will recall that we wanted to try and make up some time somewhere.
Yes. It's been my intention to inform you that we could start at 9:30 in the morning.
Tomorrow, my Lord.
Tomorrow.
That would suit us, my Lord, if that suits my learned friends.
Does that suit the parties? Yes,
Thank you, my Lord. We're indebted to your Lordship.
The court adjourns until 9:30 tomorrow morning.